Hello everyone, my name is Adrienne LeVay, and welcome to the second episode of Demystifying Absinthe, where we dig deep to uncover the truth about absinthe. I am a goth YouTuber, an opera singer, and an absinthe lover, and I have been drinking and educating people about absinthe here on YouTube for a decade. And this series is in collaboration with my friend Ted Breaux. Ted Breaux is a research scientist turned master distiller, creator of the brands Lucid Absinthe and Jade Liqueurs. He spearheaded the effort to get the US absinthe ban lifted in 2007, and I have the privilege of calling him a very dear friend. Our goal with this series is to be here as a very reliable and trusted source for people to learn the real history about absinthe, not just the myths and legends repeated and spread by disreputable absinthe brands and by people who don't know any better. But we're also here to have fun along the way. We will answer your burning questions about absinthe, but hopefully there will not be any questions about burning absinthe. Whether you are new to absinthe or you've been drinking absinthe for a while, I think you'll find this series fun and informative. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below so that myself or my friend Ted Breaux can answer those questions in a future episode. In today's episode, we discuss the events, circumstances, and propaganda that led to absinthe getting banned in the early 20th century for almost 100 years. Wow. It's going to be a big one. Now we're getting into the controversial part of absinthe's history, the part of absinthe's history that has given rise to the misconception that absinthe was hallucinogenic or psychedelic, and that's why it was banned. It's once again time to do my absinthe PSA. Well-made, authentic absinthe made both back then and now was not hallucinogenic, addictive, psychedelic, or otherwise psychoactive. Anyone who tells you otherwise does not know what they're talking about, or they are actively lying to you to turn a profit. Okay? Because it's relevant to the conversation about this misconception of pre-ban absinthe being hallucinogenic, myself and many other absinthe experts have consumed absinthe that was made before the ban in 1915. I actually have reviews of 2 of those pre-ban absinthes here on my channel, and none of us have tripped balls or gotten high off of it. So there you go. There are several moving parts that contributed to absinthe being banned, not just a singular thing. It's not as simple as it was banned because it was hallucinogenic. There were a lot of factors at play here. One thing to remember is that absinthe was one of the most popular drinks in the Western world, and by the beginning of the second half of the 19th century, absinthe was considered the national drink of France. The first bit of trouble came when a psychiatrist, Dr. Valentin Magnan, was treating alcoholics in insane asylums who were self-proclaimed absinthe drinkers, suffering from what we now know to be delirium tremens, also known as DTs, associated with late-stage alcoholism. The conclusion that he drew here is that absinthe was causing these symptoms and dubbed the condition absinthism. The wild thing here is that after drying out in the asylum, these doctors would advise these sufferers to go home and drink wine and beer because those were considered healthy alcohols. Whoa, what a time. So here's what Dr. Magnan said about absinthism. In absinthism, the hallucinating delirium is most active, most terrifying, sometimes provoking reactions of an extremely violent and dangerous nature. Another more grave symptom accompanies this. All of a sudden, the absinthist cries out, pales, loses consciousness, and falls. The features contract, the jaws clench, the pupils dilate, the eyes roll up, the limbs stiffen, a jet of urine escapes, gas and waste material are brusquely expulsed. In just a few seconds, the face becomes contorted, the limbs twitch, and the eyes strongly convulsed. The jaws gnash and the tongue projected between the teeth is badly gnawed. A bloody saliva covers the lip, the face grows red, becomes purplish, swollen, the eyes are bulging, tearful, and respiration is loud. When the movements cease, the whole body relaxes, the sphincter releases, the evacuation soiled the sick man. Suddenly, he lifts his head and casts his eyes around him with a look of bewilderment. Coming to himself after a while, he doesn't remember one thing that has happened. So essentially what he's describing here is like massive convulsions and seizures and basically, soiling yourself in the process, which is definitely not a pretty sight. And here's another thing that I find kind of funny. People saying, oh, it was hallucinogenic, it was a psychedelic, and, people were tripping balls. When they read something like this, does that necessarily sound like an enjoyable experience? I wouldn't think so. Dr. Maillon would also conduct experiments on animals such as guinea pigs and dogs by injecting them with essential oil of wormwood as an extreme attempt to prove that absinthe was harmful. These highly concentrated injections of wormwood oil would cause these guinea pigs and dogs to have epileptiform convulsions and die. Yikes. Again, absinthe only contains a very small concentration of wormwood, a drop in the bucket compared to this high concentration of wormwood oil that he was injecting into these poor animals. It's like injecting a guinea pig with pure caffeine to prove that coffee is bad for you. Same logic. So the active chemical compound in Artemisia absinthium, or grand wormwood, that Dr. Maillon believed was responsible for absinthism is thujone. Thujone is not a psychedelic or hallucinogenic compound as most people believe nowadays. In the 1970s, a British scientist actually claimed that because the chemical structure of thujone was similar to the structure of THC, which is the active ingredient in cannabis, that thujone must have a similar effect, but that has since been debunked. This is the reason why people are still trying to chase the high they think they're going to get from absinthe, and this narrative, unfortunately, is also pushed by unscrupulous crapsinthe brands to turn a profit. Thujone is actually a neurotoxic convulsant, which can result in tunnel vision, seizures, convulsions, renal failure, and ultimately death if you have too much of it. This actually did end up happening to an unfortunately thick-headed person in 1996 who drank essential oil of wormwood, thinking it was absinthe, in an attempt to trip balls because of all of the legends and misconceptions that have accumulated over the years about absinthe being hallucinogenic. Everything except the death part happened, and he spent a good amount of time in the ICU and spent 17 days total in the hospital recovering. So that's why I keep saying in my absinthe PSA that if someone tells you that absinthe, wormwood, or thujone is a hallucinogen or psychedelic, they legitimately do not know what they're talking about, or they're actively lying to you to turn a profit. So these are the consequences of spreading misinformation about absinthe. People will take this misinformation to heart, do something stupid based on that misinformation, and that will further damage absinthe's reputation. This is why I take it so seriously, and I'm not very quick to just dismiss it as, oh yeah, people don't know what they're talking about, oh, people are stupid. No, it actually does have a harmful impact. So it's not cute. It doesn't make you look cool or knowledgeable. It actually makes you an incredibly ignorant asshole, and you have no idea how many legitimate absinthe distillers you are hurting by engaging in this. You're even more of an asshole if you know it's false, but you're spreading the misinformation anyway. Just saying. Let me let you in on a little secret though. There are plants that have way more thujone in them than grand wormwood does, such as sage and rosemary. There is actually more thujone in your Thanksgiving turkey stuffing than there is in a bottle of absinthe. So, unless you're telling me that you have tripped balls or gotten high on your Thanksgiving turkey stuffing, thujone is not a hallucinogen or psychedelic. So, bringing him back for part 2 of our series of Demystifying Absinthe is my dear friend, Ted Breaux, research scientist turned master distiller. He is the man, the myth, the legend, and he is here to talk a little bit more about the history of absinthe with us today. Jumping off from our previous video, which was the origins and the golden age of absinthe, we are now discussing the propaganda and the problematic things that led up to absinthe ban in the early 20th century. So, I definitely have questions and I want to get your perspective on it.
All right. Well, I hope I have suitable answers. I will do my best.
Obviously, you're going to answer the questions from the previous video from the wonderful viewers from the first episode.
Oh, great. Yeah, I love viewer questions. Please, if you have questions about absinthe, anything at all that I can do to help contribute to a solid, reliable answer, just please ask. I love questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I wanted to ask you is, being a scientist yourself, can you talk about how ridiculously shoddy the scientific work was back then to prove that absinthe, wormwood, and thujone was harmful? I kind of like to think of it as injecting a little guinea pig with like 100% pure caffeine concentrate to prove that coffee's bad for you. So can you expand on that?
Well, okay, let's see. That's a deep deeply complex subject, and it's rooted in the mid 1800s. Well, first of all, it is a matter of science. The whole goal of science is to let observations and analysis create the narrative, and that reveals the truth. But where science gets corrupted is when we have a preconceived truth and we try to develop something that supports a certain narrative. And back then, I mean, science was very different than it is today. I mean, analytical science today is why we were able to get the ban on absinthe lifted. That has a lot to do with it. Obviously, things we can do today were unthinkable at that time. But in the mid 1800s, when absinthe was really gaining in popularity, for the most part, then and in the early days, absinthe was, it was no different than chartreuse. It was just a powerful, herbal liquor. The thing is, absinthe became extremely popular, and and to make absinthe, and I can't remember if I use this or if I said this in a previous video, but to make absinthe, you need five things. You need lots of equipment. You need labor. You need energy. You need time. You need a ton of botanicals, and those things cost money. And absinthe, in its beginnings, was not a cheap drink. Not the least of which was the alcohol, which was all taxed, which drives up the price as well. It's a strong liquor. It was the strongest liquor available in France. So the thing. So what happened here is you have something that was fashionable and expensive, relatively speaking, and it became it was something that was for the posh crowd, and of course that created a drive to make it cheaper. And where there was demand, supply certainly did follow. And by the mid 1800s, I mean, even that early, there were cheap, adulterated absinthes that were appearing, that were marketed toward the working class, toward commoners who didn't have the money to spend. And I've seen it, said by or observed by like the early about 1870 or thereabout, that I mean, there were tons of cheap adulterated absinthes available, and everybody knew that. But there were no laws in place to protect the public. So we owe a lot of gratitude, I'll say, in the story of absinthe toward a character who was a psychiatrist in France, Dr. Valentin Magnan. And he was a psychiatrist, and his field of study was degenerative, defects, problems that were believed to be genetically inherited that factored into public health. And absinthe enters the fray because he notes that many people who show up at the sanitariums are absinthe drinkers. So that's what piqued his interest, and then he started studying absinthe. And in doing so, he created a lot of animal experiments rather, that today we would deem as unthinkable. I mean, just unimaginably cruel, to illustrate that absinthe was poisonous. And the substance that he worked with was wormwood oil, and to show that this grand absinthe, grand wormwood, was toxic and just unthinkable, inhumane experiments. That, while he wrote papers, he published papers on these experiments. I mean, he received some criticism at the time, but his work was enormously popular, and it certainly made a case. And that was the basis of a lot of questionable science. And his works they were quoted for decades, his work, which, really, when you kind of look at it, it's just, it's kind of quackery. It really is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And none of his work, as far as I remember, actually used any actual absinthe. So, and that's a thing. In France, the word absinthe is synonymous with either the plant grand wormwood or the liquor. And so and using oil of wormwood as a basis to study the liquor oil of wormwood is not synonymous with absinthe. I mean, castor beans are incredibly toxic. They contain ricin, which is one of the most toxic organic compounds on the planet, but yet castor oil is relatively harmless. So castor oil can't be used to study the toxicity of the castor bean. So,
wow.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a problem, and that is a basis of a lot of bad science. And that rolls on into why that was used as a convenient basis for why absinthe was for the smear campaign that was used against absinthe.
Right.
So, yeah, it's a big problem. Scientific standards were not the same, not what they are then, what they are now. And certainly tests like that. Well, first of all, you couldn't even conduct those animal experiments, fortunately, today.
Thank God.
Yeah. Yeah. And not only that, but I mean, none of that would really hold water today. So, but yeah, work back then was certainly sensational. And the thing, it's looking back at that. I mean, that being the only basis to show that absinthe was bad. I mean, scientifically, even without that, I mean, people could still see in the streets that there were people that were drinking absinthe, that were having lots of problems anecdotally. So he was trying to make the connection here. He just wasn't really doing it in a scientifically sound way. But he's the single most prominent character when it comes to absinthe and 19th century, science, which is really kind of folkloric science. So,
yeah. And in my presentation, I did talk about like what he described as absinthism. So like the convulsions and the seizures and biting your tongue and soiling yourself and then waking up and not remembering anything.
I know about a certain incident documented in the New England Journal of Medicine in modern times in the 1990s about an individual that drank 10 milliliters of oil of wormwood. And you remember what happened to that individual.
I do.
And the effects of what happened to that individual, which was epileptic-like seizures, and that individual spent time in ICU, organ failure, all these sorts of things. I mean, what that individual experience is a lot like what Dr. Mannion reported were effects associated with absinthism in his oil of wormwood experiments.
Right.
Which is not the same thing as a liquor.
Yep.
Because you do not use oil of wormwood in making absinthe.
Nope. And anyone who does, shame on you.
Exactly. Shame synth.
Shame synth. That's so good. I love it.
Yeah.
But of course, people like to take the hallucination and convulsion thing out of context and be like, oh no, it was banned because it was hallucinogenic. No, it's banned because it was, there was a lot of nonsense going around that was misrepresenting it horrifically.
Well, understandably, if someone consumes oil of wormwood, especially on a regular basis, that can create issues. And that's because oil of wormwood contains constituents that are not present in a properly crafted absinthe. And those constituents are indeed toxic. And they can cause delirium and hallucinations and things like that. So that's where a lot of the rumors and a lot of the myths associated with absinthe are rooted in that, which is a false premise because that's not how to make proper absinthe.
Not at all.
Oil of wormwood should not be in the picture.
No. And on top of that, that does not sound like a recreational experience anyway. And I don't like that people like to mischaracterize that. It's gross.
Yeah, anyone who reads that account in the New England Journal of Medicine about what happens if one consumes oil of wormwood is not going to find that inviting.
No. No.
I hope you have good medical insurance. Let's just say that.
Yeah.
You'll have quite a copay.
It's definitely a horrible case of fuck around and find out.
Hope you have some vacation time reserved. You're going to need it for that time you're going to spend in ICU.
So, as I discussed with Ted in part 1, when something becomes immensely popular, there is a drive to make it cheaper, and absinthe was certainly no exception. There were some profiteers who were looking to benefit from absinthe's popularity, and they made cheap, toxic, adulterated knockoffs of absinthe. It was adulterated with chemicals like copper sulfate to give it that vibrant green color, as well as antimony trichloride to mimic the effect of the louche when water was added, which consumers at the time demanded because even back then they knew that the louche was a test of a good absinthe. There are mentions of these adulterated absinthes floating around as early as 1879 here in the New York Times. Check this out. But I want to stress that even though it is an American publication that these adulterated absinthes are mentioned in, these adulterated absinthes were not imported to the US. Just want to make that clear. Unfortunately, those who suffered the most from the ill effects of this adulterated absinthe were alcoholics of lower socioeconomic status. So you kind of have a double whammy of late-stage alcoholism that we mentioned earlier, and heavy metal poisoning contributing to the perception that absinthe was harmful and poisonous. Unfortunately, that perception has persisted even to the modern day. I'm not even kidding. When I first started making like absinthe TikToks on my TikTok account, some people would be in the comments being like, what is absinthe? I mean, like, what is it? What's it for? And then some doofus would come along and they would be like, oh yeah, you know, it's a poison, but when you have it like this, meaning the traditional French preparation, you know, it's an alcoholic beverage. And I'm just like, what? And when I explained to them that it's not actually a poison and that it's just a highly concentrated alcoholic beverage, they were just like, oh, I'm sorry. I thought that this method of preparation was like microdosing or something. And I'm just like, what? What? But again, that is just one example of people thinking that absinthe is poison. Like, what on earth? Anyway, carrying on. Sorry about that little tangent there. As I have mentioned on my channel before, and for the purpose of this series, it does bear repeating, this is the exact same phenomenon as the gin craze that took place about a century before the absinthism scare. There were some cheap, adulterated, unregulated gin brands that were floating around in the market in London in the 18th century, and this was causing the same effects that we see in the absinthism scare, and the same group of people who were alcoholics of lower socioeconomic status were affected. Nowadays, knowing that this happened with gin, isn't it weird that we don't see people claiming that they tripped balls from gin? Gin doesn't have the same stigma that absinthe did, oddly enough. I also want to emphasize that high-quality, respectable absinthe brands did not suffer from this issue. Notice I keep saying cheap, toxic, adulterated knockoffs of absinthe. Brands like Pernod Fils, Terminus, and many others did not cause these effects. So, tell me about the 1860 book called Absinthe and Absinthiers.
Okay, so book published in 1860 by Henri Balesta. And it's called Absinthe and Absinthiers, and it's about it's not a long book, less than 100 pages, I think, and like 7 chapters. Okay. And it is it's a small book, but it made a definite, disproportionately sized impact on the perception of absinthe, because that book published in 1860 is a very convincing anecdotal account of the culture of absinthe drinking in Paris at that time. And one of the things that Balesta, his book's important because you can see that by 1860, there is a segment of the population whose health is absolutely impacted by not just drinking copious amounts of, alcohol, but alcohol that was declared to be absinthe and absolutely unfit for human consumption. So this is when we start seeing the effects of absinthism. And a lot of those effects are synonymous with alcoholism, albeit extreme alcoholism. Right. But, once again, we have to consider that, hey, the segment of the population that's experiencing problems is not the bourgeoisie, it's the commoners, it's the people who are not of means. and this happens early on, which shows that proliferation of adulterated products was a thing by that time, and growing worse. And when we take a look at the time, like here in the United States, there was no food and beverage regulations. I mean, it was all buyer beware. In fact, by 1860 or right around that time, I think Britain was quite progressive in that it had passed some anti-adulteration laws. But remember, Britain had already been through the gin craze, and had that problem with gin, the previous century. So they knew, Britain was well acquainted with what can happen with adulterated products. But France was relatively slow. I think there was a decree passed right around that time, or maybe it was around 1870, that tried to regulate like oil of wormwood, saying it could only be bought through pharmacists.
Yeah.
And I think that was maybe sort of an attempt to limit the profiteering from
that early.
Yeah, and it's just, I mean, it's so clearly there was some knowledge of, and it wasn't just absinthe. I mean, you had fake chartreuse, you had all sorts of fake stuff out there, and it was a problem, particularly in alcohol. Not so much in wine, though, you see, because wine is something of the earth and whatever. But distilled spirits, yeah. And I know I've mentioned in a previous video that a lot of these adulterated products, they came from the warehouses of Paris and Lyon, and there was no distillation of anything. Actually, the alcohol they used, a lot of it was industrial alcohol that wasn't fit for human consumption as is, much less everything else that they added to it. Nice. Yeah, and I know that you've seen that short article from the New York Times from 1879, where they say it is without question that these adulterated products contain copper sulfate. In fact, it gives it a certain sort of metallic, acrid sort of touch that the people that drink it kind of have come to expect. Mm-hmm. And as you know, genuine absinthe tastes nothing like that.
Absolutely not.
And it was even mentioned by the early 1870s that like an absinthe could be had for, I think it was like 1/3 the cost of a loaf of bread. So this stuff, I mean, you had, on one hand, absinthe was the most, or one of the most expensive distilled spirits, but on the other hand, it was one that could be had more cheaply than anything else. Yeah. And that was only because there was so many adulterated cheap products out there that were being imbibed by those on the lowest rungs of the socioeconomic ladder.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate how history repeated itself. Yeah. Like you said, London figured it out and put some regulations in place in order to prevent the gin craze from happening again. But unfortunately, like you said, France didn't catch up.
No. And that's why I mentioned in a previous video that people who drank absinthe were very brand conscious.
Yes.
For that reason, everybody, they knew, and those who could afford to be discriminating were,
Yeah,
those who couldn't,
absolutely.
Well, they just drank whatever was coming. And, and that's why, the big insane asylum, Charenton, which is just southeast of Paris at the time.
One-way ticket.
Yeah, well, I mean, you see that, absinthe drinking was said to be an omnibus, like a public bus to Charenton. I mean, it was, that was a one-way ticket. In fact, that was a nickname for absinthe, un billet de Charenton. In fact, I think that was used so often that he was even just abbreviated to un billet, a ticket. Oh, what will you have to drink? Un billet. And they knew, okay, an absinthe it is. Yeah. I mean, that just goes to show you that, it was something that everyone was aware of, right, that didn't keep people from drinking it. But everyone was I mean, you could just sit down at a cafe and order un billet, a ticket, and they knew exactly what you're talking about. Here comes your absinthe. So I know, funny as it is.
That's actually hilarious.
Yeah, I thought so too. I mean, it's kind of like the word a Coke became synonymous with any type of cola, and and you have NBA or something like that, NBA to Charenton. I mean, that became synonymous with absinthe. In fact, it's interesting because even people that were just alcoholics, whether they were, if you look back in the literature, even people who are just alcoholics, whether they drank absinthe or not, were just called absinteurs, were just called absinthe drinkers.
So they just got it slapped on and
right,
get
like
rid of
Coke became synonymous for any type of cola, whatever. An absinthe drinker just became synonymous with someone who was an alcoholic during that time. So,
wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah,
and hilarious.
Yes, in a very pathetic way.
Yeah, right. And to this day, I'm guessing we have still not recovered any of those adulterated absinthes. Is that correct?
Officially, no. Once I did open a bottle of something that was a respectable brand, and what was in it was not. It was the only bottle of that respectable brand that I found.
Really?
That I've ever seen, and what was in it was not absinthe. I don't know. I don't understand what was going on there. I don't know if it was. I have no idea. It was not absinthe, not even adulterated absinthe. I don't know what it was, but it was something that it was almost like some type of oil. I have no idea. But no, as far as cheap adulterated absinthes, I don't know of any samples that have been found that, and not that we can verify, were full unopened. And it's because the people that had wine cellars that kept a stock of wine and spirits, they didn't buy that. They always bought the best brands. I mean, or respectable brands of some type. So it's that the odds of us coming across something like that seem to be, given what's been found, it's pretty small. But it would be great. It'd be great to find something like that.
Have a chance to study it a little bit and just what the hell was in this stuff? Right.
I mean, we know, anecdotally, we know because late 19th century literature tells us what was in it. And what to expect, but it would be great just to see it and analyze it. And I've come across, recipes for creating bad synth, fake absinthe, and like recipes using oil of wormwood. And it could be used up to several thousand part per million. I mean, I put it this way, someone who's drinking copious amounts of this stuff, and especially on a regular basis, when people talk about the delirium and the eventual epileptic seizures and the indigestion, all the problems that they, it's, and if all of those, or a lot of them, contain metal salts like copper sulfate, or at the time was called Cooper's vitriol. I mean, copper poisoning. Look at like modern day whiskey julep cups that look like, copper on the outside, but you look inside and they're coated, or they're, So, right. I mean, even, copper, especially to ingest it like that on a regular basis, you're inviting all sorts of problems. So, not to mention all the other stuff that was in there, not to mention the bad alcohol,
and the antimony trichloride to mimic
that is alleged to have been in there as well. Quite toxic.
Very toxic. Gross.
Yeah. So,
and just for the record, people like myself and Ted and many other absinthe experts and appreciators out there have had pre-ban absinthe, and there has not been a problem. So I just want to say that for the record.
No, I mean, when you look at the number of people that drank absinthe, it's not like everyone who drank absinthe had problems.
No,
I mean, the people that stored it, in wine cellars and things like that, especially when they knew it was going to be banned. I mean, they weren't having the same issues. But you didn't hear about that. You heard about the problems. You didn't hear about the non-problems.
Right.
So.
Didn't hear about the non-issues.
No, didn't hear about that. Those aren't newsworthy.
Boo.
Unfortunately, the fact that high-quality absinthes weren't to blame didn't matter to those who sought to get absinthe banned. Grand Wormwood was targeted because absinthe has Grand Wormwood in it, and Grand Wormwood wasn't in much of anything else back then. All right, so we're going to take a look at one of these propaganda posters that was used to target absinthe. So while it may seem that they are targeting like all hard alcohols at this time, we all know who the real target is. So, the top of the poster says, alcohol, behold the enemy. And then it talks about how 80 out of 100 tuberculosis sufferers are alcoholics. I don't know where they got that statistic. And then physical disorders include hand tremors, loss of appetite, weakening, general delirium, tremens paralysis, dementia, and worsening of illness and fracture injuries, which, to be fair, fracture injuries, I can totally understand if you are drunk off your ass and, to an unreasonable degree, you're kind of going to be stumbling and falling a lot, so I can see where more physical injuries would definitely be a thing, to be totally fair. And then for moral disorders, it says decreased intelligence, loss of memory, reasoning, professional incapacity, moral degradation, and irritability, violence, and fury. The most important part of this poster is that it is specifically citing the ill effects of absinthe and other hard alcohols, as opposed to the healthy effects and benefits of natural alcohols, such as beer, cider, wine, those kind of things. It was believed that any kind of alcohol that was derived from fruit or good wheat and grains and stuff like that was good, but then the other alcohols that were based on beets and potatoes and the bad grains were bad. So not only is wine not condemned, but it's actively encouraged as an alternative to absinthe. This is because this rhetoric was pushed by the French wine industry to destroy its main competitor, which was absinthe. I don't know if it's just the 90s kid in me, but it really reminds me of, this is your brain. This is your brain on drugs. Those ads. You remember those ads? Yeah. Also, the guinea pig diagram on the bottom corners just kills me. With wine, they just go to sleep, but if they have the bad alcohols, they have an epileptic fit and die. Whoa. One of the biggest impacts on the negative perceptions of absinthe was the fact that the wine lobbyists, now that the wine industry had bounced back from the phylloxera blight, began this mission of demonizing their biggest competitor, which was absinthe. They saw all these examples of neurotoxicity, heavy metal poisoning, and late-stage alcoholism culminating in the syndrome of absinthism, and pointed the finger at wormwood as causing all of these ill effects. So lots of propaganda came out to demonize absinthe. One critic actually said this: absinthe makes you crazy and criminal, provokes epilepsy and tuberculosis, and it has killed thousands of French people. It makes a ferocious beast of the man, a martyr of the woman, and a degenerate of the infant. It disorganizes and ruins the family and menaces the future of the country. That's intense. The kicker is that legitimate absinthe producers who were making the best absinthe brands at the time were actually taking extra steps to prove that their product was healthy, such as the trend of oxygenated absinthes, which were considered extra healthy because it was believed that you were drinking extra oxygen, as well as the oxygenation process removing potential impurities. Not that these brands had any, but okay. I've actually had one of these pre-ban oxygenated absinthes, which was made in 1910, and that was really interesting. I actually did a video on that if you want to check it out. And Ted has actually recreated an oxygenated absinthe in his line of Jade Absinthe. It is called Jade Terminus Oxygene, which is my top favorite absinthe of all time. I actually have a gorgeous empty bottle of it right here. Isn't that just beautiful?
In response to all of these toxic, adulterated, gross brands of absinthe that were floating around, I know that some of the respectable brands were taking extra steps to prove that their product was more hygienic and healthy. So the oxygenated absinthe that came out, tell us about that. Did they make an actual difference in the quality or purity of the absinthe? And I have definitely found that your oxygenated absinthe is absolutely exquisite. I love it. It's my top favorite. And
challenge to make that one, but yeah.
Of course it is.
Yeah.
I would love to be around when you actually make it again.
No one can be around for safety reasons. But anyway,
that's right.
That's another story.
But tell us about the oxygenation process. What's that about?
Obviously the wine industry wanted to see absinthe go away, and the absinthe industry was actually they had resources, they had money, they just weren't well represented because wine is produced everywhere, like in France, and in Switzerland as well. But absinthe came from one, for the most part, one fairly restricted area of France, and the same on the Swiss side. And just not a lot of sympathy. But people in regions, people knew that to ban the absinthe industry was going to have an economic impact, not a good one, because by that time absinthe, a lot of it was being produced, and to ban it overnight would be to cripple a part of the French spirits industry, really, and definitely in Switzerland as well. So there was a counter movement. So you had a movement that demonized absinthe and exposed all the ills and called for its banning. And on the other side, you had publications that were pro-absinthe, which made a satire of the people that wanted to ban it. And so there were definitely divided, camps in this. When the temperance movement gained steam and the sentiment against absinthe got larger, producers responded. For example, some of them put out like a brochure for the public that explained in detail how their absinthes were made. And when you read these, they go into great detail, talk about how the quality of the alcohol comes from wine, the botanicals, where they're sourced, their historical medical uses, and how there's nothing bad here. This is all deemed medicinal and culinary plants. So they were trying to portray their products as being hygienic. That had some effect, no doubt. They had journalists that came and visited, and journalists wrote in publications about their visit to an absinthe distillery and all the process and the equipment, and in an attempt to portray that their products were good. And they were. There was nothing wrong with those products.
Right.
Those weren't the ones that were causing the issues.
Mm-hmm.
But producers under the pressure and the growing sentiment that wanted to see an absinthe ban, they responded in ways that they tried to extract themselves from the debate. In some cases, they were trying to advertise themselves as Goujon free, because Mannion had made a big deal of that. And some of them, the oxygenated absinthe, the most notable being Cuisinier, which, claimed that by, this bespoke oxygenation process, it completely eliminates any harmful qualities associated with absinthe, and this should not be part of the debate. And it was more expensive than Père Nofice. It was the most expensive absinthe as per my recollection, that one in particular. And it was exported to the US. That was the whole claim that this oxygenation process reacted with any harmful properties and rendered it totally, hygienic. So, and there were even products that were competing products that were not absinthe that aimed to portray themselves as hygienic alternatives. There was one eucalypsinthe or something like that, made from eucalyptus. There were products like that deviated from the grand absinthe, saying, no, use this, it's better, drink this, it's better, it's non-harmful. And so all sorts of antics were tried and to exclude themselves from scrutiny.
That's so funny.
It was part of the time.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you. That really cleared some things up, question-wise for me in regard to oxygenated absinthes. I just find that whole thing is just super fascinating, super interesting.
Funny thing about the oxygenated topic, I just pulled out of the depths of my mind. I remember that seeing that even after the ban and after the First World War, and like in the 1920s, when anise spirits were, being reallowed gradually, and there was still some concern in France. I remember there seeing mention of like even oxygenated anise because of the complainers that were saying that, oh no, they're trying to revive absinthe and whatever, and we have this oxygenated anise. So that the belief that was a remedying step persisted even after the ban. When
That is
anise spirits,
hilarious.
yeah, when anise spirits were even under scrutiny. So,
Wow.
go figure. Yeah.
That's funny.
Oh, I know.
That's really funny. Thanks for sharing that. That's actually super interesting.
These respectable brands were also pushing for regulation, which would have solved the issue with the adulterated absinthes causing these illnesses, but the French government would absolutely not let that fly because that would have eliminated the need for the absinthe ban, which is ultimately what happened. So we kind of face a similar issue here in the US because there is still no legal definition of absinthe. So you can have like a blue-green dyed vodka on the shelf and label it as absinthe, unfortunately. Ugh. We're definitely going to get into that on our episode on how to find a good absinthe. Switzerland is the only country that has a legal definition of absinthe. All right, so now we're going to take a look at some of the absinthe propaganda because believe me, oh my God, there is so much. There was so much anti-absinthe propaganda floating around out there, especially at the very beginning of the 20th century. So again, it's really important that we take a look at this so that we understand like how all of this went down. Very important. So this first one that I'm going to show you, it's honestly not very well known and I still don't quite understand the context behind it, but I want to say that they were aiming for some like misogyny and targeting the lower classes. So you see this woman, she's sitting on the bed, she's kind of like half dressed. Who knows what just happened? I think they're kind of trying to imply that she's promiscuous, maybe? That's my thought. And then here she is preparing a couple of glasses of absinthe, one for herself and one for her little boy over here. And so the quote on the bottom of the poster says, "Take some with a little water, that won't hurt you." So it's basically implying that one, she's promiscuous, potentially, and two, that absinthe clouds her judgment, pardon the pun, and, inspires her to want to make her child drink absinthe too, I guess. So yeah, I'm thinking that this is like some misogyny as well as targeting like lower class women who are absinthe drinkers. So yeah, that one's really interesting. So this dude looks like he's totally strung out. Like I said, this is kind of reminiscent of like, this is your brain on drugs kind of thing. And he is clutching a bottle of absinthe with an absinthe spoon. And there's an absinthe glass and stuff nearby. And the poster says absinthe rend fou, which means absinthe makes you crazy. And c'est la verte qu'il nous faut. And that means like, this is the green that we need. So yeah, basically saying that he's like strung out and addicted to absinthe, that's what the impression that I'm getting from this anyway. And then in this next one, it's a very stark illustration of all the horrible things that are going to befall France if absinthe stays and remains a part of everyday life. You have this gentleman who is getting a glass of absinthe poured by this skeletal figure. He's dangling a spider on top of his head. There are these little devils, I guess, kind of like dancing around and clutching this bottle of absinthe here, just showing the whole country just going to ruin if absinthe were to stick around. And then, of course, we've all probably seen this one where this poor guy is also looking kind of strung out and addicted to absinthe, and it's being poured by, a representation of the Grim Reaper. So there's that. Pretty straightforward. We all know what they're trying to do here. And then this one's really interesting. So you have one person on one side of this who is just having regular alcohol and he's happy and drunk and sleepy. And that's what the text on the bottom says essentially, is that regular alcohol produces sleepiness in someone or makes someone feel sleepy or fills them with sleepiness. And then absinthe fills the other person with fury. So that's fun, right? And he's literally like getting mad and smashing glasses on the table. And then there are the shocked onlookers outside kind of looking in. So yeah, that's another piece of propaganda that was trying to make the point that absinthe was particularly sinister and had a sinister effect on people. So yeah. And then of course this very famous one that says l'absinthe c'est la mort, which is absinthe is death. Wow. Here's another one. This is probably, if I had to guess, around the time when people were voting to ban absinthe or not ban absinthe. So it says cri d'alarme, which is alarming cries or like sounding the alarm kind of thing. Yeah, so basically just like saying, oh, hey, how are you going to vote? We're sounding the alarm. Things are urgent in regard to getting absinthe banned. Then here's another one. Here's this gentleman of either middle or lower class who... I think he's lower class, from what I can tell here. And he's sitting at the cafe. You can tell he's had a lot of absinthe at this point already because of all the sausage on the table. And the absinthe is being poured by him by this skeletal figure. And it says, like, oh, hey, your woman is ignoring you because you're not motivated or something. So, and of course, absinthe is the target. So you see the little shop window behind them that says absinthe and vermouth, that kind of thing. And then, of course, there was a propaganda film that was released. And it says, Glenn White in Jem's great instructive play, Absinthe. And so I believe it was in this propaganda film that was made by Universal Pictures like a very long time ago, early 20th century, where this guy... is drinking absinthe and his life goes to shit. His wife leaves him and all that stuff, and then he wakes up, realizes it was a dream, and then throws his bottle of absinthe over the bridge and gets rid of it. Choosing a good life instead. It's really interesting. So yeah, those are just like some of the pieces of like propaganda, sounding the alarm, making things sound super urgent, being like, oh hey, if you have regular alcohol, you're fine. If you have absinthe, you're fucked. And finally... oh boy, here we go. And the final nail in the coffin to facilitate the banning of absinthe came in 1905 when a Swiss farmer, Jean Laffray, went on a murderous rampage, allegedly after having 2 glasses of absinthe, killing his 2 daughters and pregnant wife, and attempting to take his own life afterward, but being unsuccessful. During the trial, a Swiss psychiatrist made a special point of saying that the murder was a classic case of absinthe madness. Here we go. However, everyone ignored the fact that he had consumed an absolute butt-ton of other alcohol, including 7 glasses of wine, 6 glasses of cognac, coffee laced with brandy, 2 crème de menthe, and 2 glasses of absinthe after having a sandwich for lunch. Sandwich, that sounds good. It was actually on the advice of his defense attorney to attribute his drunken murderous rage to the absinthe he had consumed, and that's what the press focused on. He was later found guilty and sentenced to 30 years of imprisonment. 3 days after the trial was over, he unalived himself in his jail cell in February of 1906. Whoa. That's a wild ride, man. This sparked so much public outrage and moral panic, and this was further ammunition, pardon the pun, for wine lobbyists to claim that absinthe was not only harmful, but inspired people to murder and violent behavior. This led to a petition to ban absinthe in Switzerland, getting 82,000 signatures. Whoa. However, cafe owners and legitimate absinthe producers did try to fight against it, but were unsuccessful. This resulted in absinthe's eventual ban in Switzerland in early October of 1910. So World War I was also approaching, and the French government was faced with this decision of banning absinthe. They didn't want France and its culture to decline, and they didn't want to be associated with the working class and bohemian culture that came to be linked with absinthe. With the Great War, the French government also didn't want soldiers to be drunk on absinthe in the trenches, but still provided them with daily rations of wine. Funny how that works. So the French government ultimately banned absinthe in 1915. What about in the US? Why was it banned in the US in 1912, 3 years sooner than it was in France? Shockingly enough, and contrary to popular belief, it wasn't because there was an absinthism issue here in the US. That had more to do with the perception of absinthe rather than anything actually unsavory happening in the US as a preemptive measure. There were some newspaper articles in American newspapers that were reporting on the absinthism scare happening in France. Here's actually one from the New York Times from 1908 discussing the debate on absinthe banning. And here's a medical journal written by Dr. Emma Elizabeth Walker, an assistant surgeon who graduated from Johns Hopkins in 1906, to discuss the effects of absinthism based on the experiments of Dr. Magnon and others. There were absolutely no cases of absinthism in the US, and none of the cheap, toxic, adulterated knockoffs of absinthe that were plaguing France were ever exported to the US. I want to make that super clear. But there was a growing movement to get alcohol across the board banned in the US. I kind of like to think of the absinthe ban as a warm-up or a springboard to prohibition in the US as well. The countries that did not ban absinthe were the UK, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, the Czech Republic, and Denmark.
So a lot of that propaganda, I mean, obviously that was ridiculous, but again, we have to put it in the context of a time when there was no regulation, and you had these fake scents that no person of means would touch. And even in the old sketches, you can see when they show someone, like in a cheap bar, some commoners in kind of raggedy clothes drinking absinthe. And some of these sketches, they make like the green color in the glass is like cloying, like radioactive looking. And so we have to ask ourselves, is that really representative of, of the actual color, which if they're using copper sulfate, it very well may have been. That has gone noticed, but the propaganda, I mean, in France, they really were seeing poor alcoholics having serious issues, but where the propaganda gets weird is when you leave Europe, and especially when you look, when you see debate about the absinthe debate, you see debate in North America, like in the US or in England, for example, about the whole absinthe debacle in France. And that's when things get weird, because the problems that people were seeing in France, and it's interesting because I think it's a New York Times article from 1908. I know I sent you. It's a short article talking about the absinthe debate. Yeah, from 1908, talking about the absinthe debate in France and saying, well, since like Belgium, for example, banned that. Well, you have France, all the cheap absinthes are pouring into France now from countries that have banned it. And you see this, like here in the US, we weren't having those problems. Absinthe was quite, was popular and becoming more popular, but we weren't having those issues. But it was the fear of it because of these what was happening, or what was being reported, what was being exaggerated, what was being used as fodder by the Temperance League and the other, and so the Temperance League. Well, in France, it was called the Ligue Nationale contre l'Alcoolisme, the National League Against Alcoholism, and their symbol was this blue cross.
Yeah.
And so when you see like absinthe being banned in the posters, you'll see like somewhere this blue cross appears, and that's what it is. It's the League Against Alcoholism.
That is so interesting. Yeah, I know that for like the poster that is showing La fin de la fée verte, the end of the Green Fairy, shows the Green Fairy slain at the feet of a politician, and there's that dagger with the blue cross sticking out of her ribcage.
With the handle of the dagger is the blue cross, which is the
wow.
Right, and so that's why you see that, and that's why that appears now and again. So that was the equivalent of the French, temperance movement.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's so cool. My mind is blown.
Yeah, I mean that was just, that's why this blue cross appears in some of this stuff, and that's what it is. And they, that definitely gained steam in the latter part of the 19th century, and definitely in the early 20th century. And but that was a whole, here we had a whole movement, and it wasn't limited to just continental Europe. I mean, that was here in the US as well. Alcoholism was a big problem in the late 19th century, and to understand this, it's really, I'm not really a student of social history so much, or a scholar of social history, but there are events that happened at that time that exacerbated a lot of what was going on. For example, you see some reference to the Franco-Prussian War, which was a war between Prussia and France. It lasted about 6 months. And for France, it was a bit of a national embarrassment. It really was. It definitely, part of that put a spotlight on alcoholism in the French military. I read a really interesting statistic, and it was something like 75% of court martials in the French military in the second half of the 19th century were alcohol related. So alcoholism was, in general, was a big problem. And of course, absinthe bore the brunt of all that, because that was the leading edge. If you wanted to attack alcoholism, absinthe was the poster child of that. And it became the poster child for all alcoholism at the time. And then in 1894, you had a national scandal called the Dreyfus Affair. which was a complete miscarriage of justice, a complete travesty of justice against a French military officer who was happened to be Jewish, and he was falsely accused of treason. And treasonous acts did happen, but he wasn't at fault. And then there were exonerating circumstances. They were found the documents used to indict him were falsified, and the upper echelons of the French military who were responsible, rather than admit their error, just doubled down on the miscarriage of justice. And it had, we have socially divisive issues today, which are fueled by the likes of social media and the internet. Of course, back then it was all journals, and the nation was divided, was a divided camp, and it was a lot of anti-Semitism as a result of that. And, ownership in some of the big absinthe distilleries like Vale Picard, which owned Pernod Fils at the time, the largest absinthe distillery worldwide. And so that was Jewish ownership. So absinthe was dragged into this whole very divisive national scandal, by no fault of its own. So that was absinthe was deemed to be like a tool of the Jews, and oh my goodness, I mean, it was just, looking back, it seems so ridiculous, but I'm sure looking back, we'll see a lot of the divisive subjects, now will be ridiculous in retrospect. But
yeah,
so,
no kidding.
Yeah, absinthe found its way into every social debate, national scandals.
Tell me how that
whatever.
works.
Yeah, that's it. Absinthe was a scapegoat for all society's ills. Somehow or another, it was related. And if even alcohol was related, then absinthe was the poster child for that. So, yeah.
Stupid. I do remember in an interview that you did with Dr. Sledge, where with World War I approaching, they were just like, oh, World War I's approaching and we got to get rid of this green curse. And they didn't want soldiers to be drunk in the trenches, I think you said. But we're still supplying them with daily rations of wine.
Well, the wine industry, wine was praised as this wonderful, wholesome, product that was, product of the earth, and, something that, wine, beer, cider, these were wholesome products that were completely natural. And, it was these distilled spirits, especially those that were, came from bad alcohol, so distilled spirits were separated. So the wine industry was allied with the temperance movement, because wine is not really alcohol. Oh, it's just it's just this wholesome product. I mean, that people drink every day. It's just wonderful and not injurious to health. So the wine industry was fueling this whole thing. When it found placing itself carefully, being able to position itself on the righteous side of the argument. So yeah, I mean, but by the time that the beginning of the First World War, in 1914. You have to think that absinthe had been banned in like the Netherlands and Belgium and Germany, and Switzerland had written it into its constitution. That ban went into effect in October 1910. So France was like this last, bastion of absinthe drinking culture. And at the beginning of the First World War, absinthe was banned. That ban went into effect in early 1915. And at the time, France was banning all high-proof spirits because, and that was to prevent, once again, the French military associated with alcoholism, that got put, this was a serious war at hand. And that's how the French government decided that it was going to keep alcohol, out of the military, which had a very serious job to do, which of course was true. The casualties, the toll from World War I were horrendous. And probably factored what, as I mentioned in a previous video, why we find absinthe squirreled away in wine cellars from around that time. But that was part of the strategy. And high proof spirits were not legalized again until after the war. But absinthe, of course, was not.
Wow, that's amazing. Obviously there was this like perception issue as far as like the US banning absinthe by 1912. We talked briefly about Dr. Emma Elizabeth Walker, who put out a medical study in 1906 last night as we were planning on filming today's video. So talk to me about that.
Yeah, Dr. Emma Walker was she had a medical degree from Johns Hopkins. Definitely, she was a pioneer as a educated woman, physician, working out of Manhattan. She had a keen interest in women's health, which is, I think that is the bent by which she enters the picture of absinthe. But one who studies the history of absinthe science, her name appears, and she becomes a prominent figure because in 1906 she releases this study. Dr. Mannion, late 19th century. I mean, he gave talks in England on psychiatry, and that involved absinthe. And his research obviously makes it across the pond, makes it to North America, because in 1906 she enters this very interesting piece, the scientific piece, which is a digest of this research that she's done. And I think she is keenly interested on the impacts absinthe has on women's health, because certainly it does in the counterculture of France and the cabarets and all the social liberties that France and Paris and Parisian culture in particular have to offer. I mean, the health of young women, absinthe is a factor. We know that absinthe was definitely something that was seems to go hand in hand with the cabarets of Paris.
Yeah.
And that culture, and characters like Toulouse-Lautrec with his hollow walking stick filled with absinthe that he took to the cabarets. But the ladies of in that culture were certainly well accustomed to absinthe, and we know there are famous paintings of women sitting in cafes drinking absinthe, and this is probably what drew the attention of Dr. Walker. So in that report from 1906, she recommends that absinthe. She sees she reads Mannion's reports and all this science associated with it, that where absinthe is deemed to be this horror, and even going back to like the 1860s, 1870s, there are other. Absinthe is not the only. I mean, opium is a problem. Laudanum, which is tincture of opium, its use is prevalent, and so opiate addiction is a problem. Other problems, cocaine, that is a problem, becoming quite popular. So all these things, absinthe is, substance abuse in general is rearing its ugly head in Western civilization. And we're seeing that more and more. And so by the early 1900s, when Dr. Walker, I mean, this is, absinthe is a factor. It's one of those things that factors into health. And she's reading this science from the, late 19th century. And she's coming to as anyone would, seeing what she's seeing, to the conclusion that absinthe should be banned. It's something that should be banned in the U.S. And of course, 6 years later, it would be. But, by that time being passed in 1906, you have the Pure Food and Drugs Act, which is the first act, in U.S. history that controls substances that are deemed to be threats to public health. And absinthe escapes that in 1906, but then it comes into play in 1912. But she is when you read what she writes, I mean, it's very, very intelligent, very sane, very logical conclusion. The thing is her opinion is rooted, the foundation of her opinion carries the same flaw, the same fault that earlier researchers like Dr. Mannion do, and that all this research is associated like with oil of wormwood and not the actual spirit. Right. So again, oil of wormwood is toxic. We know it is. No reputable producer of absinthe used that. So therefore, it cannot be used as a basis with which to draw conclusions about absinthe.
No.
Right. So, but she's caught in the same web, in the same trap. So her conclusions, and she's right. The thing is the problems that, all these problems that she's researching that are happening, they're not happening in the U.S.
No.
And if they are, it's something that it's so obscure that it doesn't really rise above the noise and come to the surface, because the absinthes that were imported to the U.S. were not products that were made. They were not cheap adulterated products made with oil of wormwood.
Nope.
So
not at all. I do have to remind people of this a lot, because they're just like, oh, well, if absinthe wasn't a problem, then why did the US ban it before France did? And I'm just like, it was a perception thing. It was a preemptive measure. Like, there were not any kind of reports of absinthism as we recognize it in the context of back then.
Right.
None of that happened.
You did not have a culture of absinthism was not a thing in North America.
No.
Absinthe was something that was drank, absinthe frappes and something that was used in cocktails, and we were using good products because those are the ones that were exported. So
yeah, the good products made it over here, the bad ones didn't.
Exactly. So there is a stark line of delineation, and that's why we don't see the effects of absinthe. Absinthe was banned in the U.S. not because it was causing problems; it was a precautionary measure because the U.S. authorities were aware of all the controversy in France. It definitely made its way here, both in science and in culture, in the way of books. Some early silent films, absinthe is demonized. I mean, all this stuff does make it over. We don't have the internet yet.
No.
But it does make it over. European culture does make an impact. It certainly makes an impact in places like New Orleans and New York, cosmopolitan cities. Yeah, and the U.S. authorities were aware of it. And there's something, and it's interesting because I asked you to read something.
Okay.
So I sent you 2 paragraphs, the first 2 paragraphs of a study from commissioned. So it's a chemist named Hummingbird from France, commissioned to study absinthe in 1901.
Mm-hmm.
And he publishes a study, and the first 2 paragraphs in his study exposed the whole issue that if the question he asked could be definitively answered,
mm-hmm.
it would put everything before it into play.
Yes. All right. Would you like me to read it?
I would like you to read it. Read it. So this is the English translation.
If there is a product that is not very studied analytically, it is the liquid sold under the trade name of absinthe or absinthe extract. This is so true that I have not seen anywhere the definition of this everyday consumer product. This definition is necessary, however, if we want to determine under what circumstances the product sold under this name is or is not absinthe, and it is important, first of all, to establish it.
Thank you. And what Hummingbird is telling us is that if you want us to study absinthe, you first have to tell us what it is. Because what's being sold is absinthe. And he says extract of absinthe because absinthe sold in France say extrait d'absinthe. It's absinthe concentrate. That's why you add water to it. Okay?
Right.
So that's what he's telling us. He says we can't study this unless we have a proper definition for it, because what's sold as absinthe encompasses all kinds of things that we don't know. What is it define? We have to first define what it is that we are studying in order to study it. And we can't even satisfy that first question. And that has always been the problem going back to when the adulterated products first appeared, is without a legal definition of absinthe. You have, champagne, cognac, armagnac, a cheap Morbier cheese. I mean, all of these products have an appellation of control, which basically functions as a legal definition. To call something champagne, it has to be, wine grapes from a certain reason. For certain reason, it can only be, certain types of grapes. It's got to be a certain method. That's what controls the quality. In absinthe, there was no legal definition, and it was always, and this was the complaint of the absinthe producers from the time. They wanted to establish a legal definition. Naturally, the wine industry and its lobbyists opposed that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they wanted to promote that absinthe was bad.
Yeah.
So that is that, and that has always been the problem. It remains a problem today. Today, there is only one country that has a legal definition of absinthe, and it's Switzerland.
Switzerland.
The U.S. does not, and believe me, we've tried. Maybe one day. The EU does not. The only difference between today and 150 years ago is that today we have broad food and beverage safety regulations that prevent what happened then from happening all over again today. That's the only thing that saves us.
Like you and I have discussed, it's been frustrating because you can literally have like blue-green dyed vodka on the shelf at Total Wine and it can have the label as absinthe and no one's gonna question it or try and get that brand shut down.
People don't know. And
People
that's the
don't
whole
know, they
thing.
don't get it.
You can put anything in a bottle and call it absinthe and sell it. And there's
Yeah.
nothing to stop you. And basically, people capitalize on consumer ignorance. That's been going on since the beginning of the absinthe renaissance in the mid 1990s.
Yep.
And that has always been the problem, is educating consumers is the number one hedge against profiteering, or as they called it in the late 19th century, cupidity, which is a strange word. The word for greed in French is cupide. So, and it's funny to see that cupidity, which is greed, avarice, which is the motive to sell cheap, fake, adulterated products under a pretense of marketing lies and BS and nonsense.
And in episode 4 of Demystifying Absinthe, I am going to be making a video about how you can find a good absinthe. There is a lot that goes into it, and because I've been reviewing and evaluating absinthe for 10 years now on YouTube, I want to be able to share my knowledge and share my expertise and my experience with my viewers so that they feel more empowered to go to their local liquor shop and be like, okay, I know what to look for. I know what to avoid. Let's do this.
The number one weapon is knowledge, education.
Honestly, that was a really good way to leave off that section. So I appreciate what you had to say about the regulation thing. That's amazing. Alrighty, so now I'm going to pull up viewer questions.
I'm ready. Let's go. What do viewers have to ask?
My friend Atoli, he had a question about pre-ban absinthe classification by quality. So nowadays, absinthe by quality is not depending on alcohol strength, but in pre-ban era, it seems it was a bit different. For example, superior or Swiss quality absinthe was usually 65 to 72%. Fine was 60 to 65%. Semi-fine was 50 to 55%, and ordinaire was 45%. Was absinthe quality regulated by law? And can you tell me more about that and why the maximal strength of absinthe was exactly 72 and no more, no less? Thanks in advance.
Okay, Atoli, that's a very good question. And no, to answer right off the bat, there was no law. There was no law. The earliest Père Novice, as per my recollection, was 75% or thereabouts. And later on, you find, for example, we take a brand, Père Novice, which was the biggest brand back in the day, by far. So, and by the late 19th century, you find that there are 3 different grades. You have the 68%, which is 136 proof. You have the 60%, which is 120 proof. And you have 45%, which is 90 proof. Okay. And those were 3 grades and they were priced differently. So the top grade would have been the 68%. But starting from the bottom, the 45% would be something like pastis strength. Remember, all of these were meant, these were all meant to be concentrates. Add ice water, sugar, if you like.
We know the drill.
So the 45% was the base grade. That was the standard, the bar brand, the standard inexpensive product. It was something that it wasn't just diluted. It was a different protocol, I believe, simplified quite a bit. Something meant to be low cost Père Novice. The 60% was a mid-grade, something that appears rarely. I don't even know that except maybe in a museum, I don't know that I've ever seen a 45. I'm sure I have at some point, but it's not something that really appears. The 60 I have. Okay. The 60 is a mid-grade. That's something better. That's a fairly standard grade. The 68 would be the flagship, believed to be, or by testing shown to be, the minimum strength at which the color would be indefinitely stable.
Okay.
And that's why you see 68 appear across various brands. It's more than just imitation. I mean, that was a strength, like the minimum strength to keep the color stable. There were occasionally some stronger ones, especially in the earlier days, like 72%. The 72% is something that you see Edward Pernod export, like tropical export strength.
Okay.
Would be an exception. Like 72% would be something very strong and also more expensive. The alcohol is a cost. The alcohol tax is a cost. So it's something that was more, more expensive, but something that probably would hold up just indefinitely under all sort of ambient conditions. And you really found nothing below like 45%. You really can't have a lot of, herbal content and keep it stable. Something like lighter, like pastis would be, the norm, but nothing concentrated like a real absinthe. And that's why you see the different grades. And it wasn't any law. They were just sort of de facto standard marketing standards, you could say. But yeah, with Pernod Fils, the flagship product was 68%. Edward Pernod 65, CF Burger 65. So the flagship products are definitely going to be somewhere between like 65 to 72%. And that was normal. And those would be very stable over time.
Yeah, and you have definitely carried on that tradition with your absinthes. They range from 65 to 72%, depending on what was happening.
Yeah, you can't have the same concentration and at a lower percentage of alcohol. It just doesn't work.
No.
So yeah, and the thing is you can't, and I should mention that you might see some absinthes being sold at like 80%, or I saw one 90 something percent. Well, that's rubbish because that's above still strength. They're not distilled. That's just taking alcohol and adding things to it. Because with absinthe, I mean, still strength, 72%, 75%, you're getting close to, that would almost be like the equivalent of like cask strength whiskey. Basically almost the way it comes off the still.
I think the highest percentage that I have ever had personally was 77%. Absinthe Emeraude Verte, I think. It was a Swiss absinthe that my friend Adrian sent me.
Which basically is like, straight out of the still.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, honestly, anything higher than that, I always tell this to people, but anything higher than 74%, you should be a little more wary of.
Yeah, back in the day, 74% would be unusual. And what was really interesting back in the day, I say really interesting, I mean, a bit unusual by modern standards, is to see a blanche at high proof. Yeah, and there were some.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Hope that answers your question, Natoli.
Of course, he's going to appreciate that. He's a very big fan. So next question is from Leanne Taylor. She said, "Thank you for this. So interesting to have a deep dive from engaging and knowledgeable experts." I appreciate that she puts me in the same category as you. Very sweet. But she said, Culpeper's 1653 Pharmacopoeia Londinensis recipe included another spirit distilled not only with common wormwood and anise, but also fennel and Roman wormwood. I wonder if this recipe arose out of the traditional French or Swiss region, or maybe it was learned from people in that region. I find it intriguing and might have its origins elsewhere. I wonder if you have any thoughts about this.
Yeah, I do have thoughts about it. So in a previous video, I mentioned that so this is happening in England, mid-1600s. Nicholas Culpeper publishes a book called The Complete Herbal in 1653. And I mentioned, actually, I goofed here because The Complete Herbal, published in 1653, it's unusual because it is a guide to medicinal plants, published in English. So if you could read English, and not everyone could read in those days, but if you could at least read English, you could understand it, which I'm sure upset a lot of doctors, because medical books, things like that, were typically in Latin, which means only the educated people could, read it and properly disseminate it.
Yeah.
This, privileged knowledge to the masses, right? I mean, so 1653, Culpeper publishes A Complete Herbal. He's got wormwood in it, more than one type, actually. He talks about the plants. So it's in 1675, 22 years later, that Culpeper publishes Pharmacopoeia Londinensis, which is a complement to the Complete Herbal because it doesn't just talk about the plants, but it talks about actual preparations you can make with the plants. Everything from potent medicinal liquors to ointments to, so it's a comprehensive medical preparation book.
Yeah.
And in that book, he's got, so he mentions there's more than one place, as per my recollection, he mentions distilling absinthe with anise seeds or with fennel. So the concept of absinthe goes way back before Dr. Ordinaire and the Henriot sisters and the legend in Switzerland. Yeah, it goes back a long way. And in one of I know that there's one product that Culpeper tells you how to make, that involves grand absinthe, involves Roman wormwood and fennel or anise seeds. And there's other stuff in it like nutmeg, and there's ginger and galangal. Yeah, these exotic medicinal plants that come from the East Indies, which were, making an important impact in European, colonial European medicinal circles. So, yeah, all these associated with like galangal and ginger associated with digestive issues, and for which they're still used today. So he describes this as something like aqua absinthe compositus, like composite spirit of wormwood, which is a medicinal preparation. So yes, we see that going back 100 years prior, at least, that absinthe effectively exists not as a tipple, but is something that is in a medicinal preparation. So the concept of absinthe, distilling, bitter, plants that just taste terrible, like grand absinthe, bitter plants, with other plants that improve the flavor, like anise and fennel, is not a new concept.
Nope.
I know the Italians around that time and before, going back to the 1500s, probably 1400s, I don't know, somewhere way back. There is one, and I can't remember exactly what it is. You can look it up, Leanne, but there is a Italian medical school which specializes in the preparation of distilled medicinal elixirs, right? And that knowledge, and I haven't, dug too deeply in that, but Mediterranean plants like anise and fennel and grand absinthe, no doubt, make an appearance in there. So the concept of absinthe, distilling wormwood with anise and fennel and other plants, goes back a long way, probably to the Renaissance. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Well,
hope that answers your question, Leanne.
Yeah,
that's a deep rabbit hole.
Definitely deep rabbit hole.
A deep rabbit hole.
In and of itself is just a deep rabbit hole. There's so much to unpack, and
many tangents.
It really grinds my gears when people just reduce it down to one thing. Oh, it was just banned because it was hallucinogen. No, there are so many layers to the history of absinthe, and that's why we're doing this series.
Can't know it all. Yeah.
No, but you're pretty close to knowing it all.
No, but I know enough to get myself into a lot of trouble. So just enough.
Yeah, you knew enough for us to cross paths.
Inevitably, that would happen.
Yeah. Alrighty, so last question. Integral systemic anomaly. And one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight this comment in particular is that comments like this really remind me of why I do what I do in the first place, why I review absinthe, why I educate people about it. I thought it was very sweet, and he also had a question for you, so I'm just going to read the whole thing.
Okay.
So he said, I am French, and I am sad to see that 99% of people in my country don't know anything about absinthe. Foreigners always caricaturize us with a beret, a big baguette, and a glass of wine, but it should be a glass of absinthe. The League Against Alcoholism and the wine lobby killed the Green Fairy La Fée Verte on purpose. Interesting to see a Goth American woman making the green fairy noble again. Please keep going. Yes, if you can ask your friend Ted if Jade Liqueurs will make one day again another beautiful absinthe spoon.
Yeah, the Jade Spoon was actually that was the brainchild of my friend Peter Schaff, and that was made a long time ago,
Yeah.
like 20 years ago, um, or thereabouts. Yeah, so I have to dig and find my own. Be perfectly honest. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to make that again if it was practical, and that's always the key. It's practicality. But
Yeah.
it's an interesting idea, and in fact, you know what? I'm going to have to give that. I will have to give that spoon to my friend Carrie Renee Boncas, who runs
Oh, oh
MasonAbsinthe.com.
yes. I know
Yeah,
Carrie.
maybe we can do something like that with the jade spoon, because that's when you're talking about. It was a nice spoon. It was a good spoon. Um, yeah, and he's absolutely right about French culture being shockingly behind in the recognition of absinthe, because at the time all the bohemians, right, who were the counterculture because they were anti-politician, anti-clergy, anti all the means of social control, right, and they celebrated absinthe as the national drink. Even though you can say that absinthe was invented in Switzerland and it was definitely prevalent throughout Swiss culture, but in France it was a national drink and associated with Parisian culture, which was the cultural universe back in those days. And yeah, I mean that's the thing. It's always been surprising to me that aside from from a handful of individuals in France who I've known for a very long time, that how, I mean, in the early days, 25 years ago, if I mentioned absinthe to someone in France, I may as well have said cocaine, because, yeah, you may as well be talking about some kind of a drug, because the misunderstanding was so pervasive and so just permeated, I mean, so deeply and indelibly that it's just, trying to get that change like moving a mountain. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But the reality is, yeah, it's the national drink, and it's a part of French culture, and that's why so many people know about absinthe, because it's something that you find you're going to come across. You cannot study the history of Western culture without coming across it, and it was the national drink, and it was something that was, I mean, it was nationwide, and it was a fashionable. I think it was Oscar Wilde who said that something like I've never truly become accustomed to absinthe, but it fits my style so well. You know, yeah. I mean that was I think it was such a indelible part of culture and such a fashionable thing. That it was just part of French culture, and it's and it should be. I mean, it was, and yeah, and so that's why it's slowly, people, I think, just out of curiosity, are willing to revisit the whole thing. But yeah, I mean, still, even today, yes, the myths of absinthe are still pervasive in France. It's gotten better, but
Yeah, it's
yes,
gotten better.
it had to be reintroduced by people who are not French to
Yeah,
be,
shocking.
sort of, yes, to be accepted. So, and still only, with reluctance. So yeah, he's definitely correct about that.
Yeah. Well, he'll be happy to hear about the potential of the Jade um absinthe spoons coming back. I would also love to see them come back. Uh Add them to my
Hmm.
collection, even though I don't take my absinthe with sugar for obvious reasons.
We'll check it out.
Yeah.
I'll take a look at
Thank
it.
you. Yeah.
I have one somewhere. I've got to find it. I may have more than one. I don't know.
Send me a picture when you can. I'd love to see it.
Okay. I'll have to look for it first, but I've got
Dig
one
around
somewhere.
for it.
I think it's packed away. Yeah, I got to find it.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you have viewers that want to ask questions, definitely do. We love questions. Absinthe is full of questions. It's the only way that you learn anything. And for me, it's good to revisit some of this stuff in my head, because it's not like I think about it every day. And there's a lot of fun, a lot of interesting anecdotes and all this. So it's just
Yeah.
it's the challenge of trying to take our minds that are, grown up in the age of the internet and whatever, and try to put ourselves back in the shoes of the people from that time, and understand the way things looked and the way things were. And that's the key. It's hard to do, but that's the key to understanding everything that was happening.
Absolutely. And Ever since I got involved in absinthe like 10 years ago now that I am thinking about it, reflecting on it, it has changed my life in the weirdest and most unexpected but positive way possible.
Yeah, ruined my career as a research scientist, but hey, whatever.
Oh, that's hilarious. Well, Ted, thank you so much for lending your expertise and your knowledge to us again for this episode.
My pleasure.
And our next episode is going to be on the resurrection of absinthe. So we'll be talking about the clandestine distillers in Switzerland that were still making it. We're going to talk about the resurgence in the 1990s. All that good stuff is going to be in episode 3. And then, like I said, in episode 4, we are going to talk about how you can find a good absinthe on the market today so that you don't feel quite so lost when you go to Total Wine.
Sounds great. I think I know a little bit about both those topics.
Just a little.
Yeah, maybe.
In the next episode, we're going to discuss absinthe's resurrection, which Ted, of course, knows a great deal about. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Ted and I are working really hard on this series, and we've poured a lot of love and dedication and time and effort into it. So I really appreciate that you guys are participating in the conversation, asking questions, sharing your own experiences and knowledge about absinthe, because that's what we're here to do. So again, if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to leave those questions in the comment section down below so that my friend Ted or myself can answer those questions in future episodes of Demystifying Absinthe. So thank you so much, everyone, for watching, and thank you so much to my patrons for your support every single month. I really appreciate it. I literally cannot do what I do without you. Don't forget to subscribe for more content about absinthe, the goth subculture, gothic literature, and a little bit of opera, because we do a little bit of everything around here. And to everyone, you're amazing. I love you, and I will see you guys next time. Bye!